Hello, welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called Steely Dan. I like them, but I don't love them. And it's a band that I know on this channel. I'm sure that many of the people will watch this who like prog and who like fusion. And people who even like classic rock. There may be a few out of you that really love Steely Dan. I have met throughout my life a whole ton of people who absolutely adore Steely Dan. The great Rick Beato continually refers to them on his channel. They seem to be to him a beacon of what absolute quality is in musicianship, pop music, rock music, improvisatory music, jazz, fusion, whatever. It seems to him that they are the ultimate in terms of quality. I have never quite felt like that with Steely Dan. I obviously heard Steely Dan many years ago when I was getting into music, and I just discounted them straight away. It just sounded like sort of Muzak-y, poppy stuff. It was sophisticated, I could hear that, and there was some great playing on there. But for me, I couldn't see the difference between that and, say, a Larry Carlton album or a David Sanborn album. It was basically that sort of later 70s Muzak-y fusion, but with vocals on. Now, to describe it like that is really mean. You know, now I'm older and wiser, I can appreciate what Steely Dan were doing. So on this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and start off by I'll start off with the criticisms, and then I will go to what I think is great about them. So this isn't a hatchet job, this is just my opinion about Steely Dan. This is all this video is going to be, so that I have a video about Steely Dan on my channel, because I thought, shall I do a rank the albums? I thought, I'm not the one to rank the albums. I've listened to them all my life. There's some of the tracks I absolutely love. I've spoken about albums like Aisha, because of that incredible Steve Gadd solo, and it's absolutely incredible. All I own in terms of the actual albums, the ones I'd really listen to, would be Steely Dan's Greatest Hits, which is opened up behind me, the gatefold, and Asia. I've listened to the other albums. I could sort of take it or leave it. So why can I take it or leave it? Well, let's start. You know, Steely Dan are a duo of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. Walter Becker sadly died a few years ago. Donald Fagen has carried on under the band name. Whether they'll do any albums, I don't know. For me, I can't see how it can be Steely Dan and not Donald Fagen, right? Donald Fagen's solo albums, while I'm thinking about them, especially Nightfly and Kamakiriad, or whatever it's called, I really like those albums. I've listened to those albums as much as I've listened to Aisha or The Greatest Hits or Countdown to XT. I've listened to quite a bit. So I don't quite get that, right? But I think the reason why Donald Fagen's still going, because there's a great interest in this band still. They're perceived as being one of the great rock bands of all time. They don't get perceived in the same way as you would perceive a fusion group. They're seen as a great band, and the reason for this is because of the vocals and the songs. Their songwriting is incredibly strong, and it utilises, especially as the albums went on, they sort of moved from a sort of funky, rocky, sort of Doobie Brothers type of sound and become more and more sophisticated as the original members sort of fall away, who were great players, and they start to bring in the cream of the session scene, which at that time, you know, in New York and Los Angeles, was the greatest session scene that's probably ever existed. Musicians that could do feats of genius. And Steely Dan seemed to utilise this more and more in a pursuit for absolute perfection. And I think this is the problem I have with Steely Dan. There seems to be an anal retardedness about the band. There seems to be perfection for perfection's sake. Steely Dan have almost become synonymous with the idea of perfection. You know, this idea that you would spend months in the studio with the best engineers, the best producers, the best musicians, and then get them to play over and over and over again until they get the absolute perfect take. bringing in all sorts of different musicians, indulging their sort of artistic auterness, you know, this idea that Walter Becker and Donald Fagen are in absolute control and they're not going to let that product out until it's absolutely perfect, and they're going to scrutinise every aspect of every tune, you know, and they want everything locked as much as they possibly can. They want all the harmonies to be as luscious and big as they possibly can. They want the production to be as wide and expansive and detailed and beautiful as it possibly can. You know, the amount of times I've been in a studio and someone's got new monitors and they'll go, you know, let's try these monitors out. Now, it's actually Nightfly is the album they usually use, but it's that type of music. It's nerdy, right? Train spottery, stamp collecting, anal retentive, sock drawer in order, albums in order. It's that whole thing. If you are that type of person, you're going to love Steely Dan, and you're going to relish that commitment to perfectionism and all the stories that surround them. You know, like on Asia, bringing in about 150 guitarists, and they all the best guitarists in the world just put solo after solo after solo until they get the right solo and it's just right, and then they go, we've nailed it. We don't know what we're looking for, but we found it, you know. And they found this thing, this search for the Holy Grail. I find that really difficult, and I hear it in the music. So the music sounds antiseptic and clinical to me. It's very tasty playing. As the albums go on, there seems to be a crossover from the fact that they're after perfection, but you can't achieve it in a 70s recording studio. As the recording studios get bigger and they got more tracks and they get more technology, you can see them using the technology to tighten that up. Now, I think there's a peak point, which is probably Asia, where those two things, the chaos of the 70s recording studio and then them using that tightness to try and get it there, that's there's an absolute magical point where those two things of sort of chaos and order are completely imbalanced, and I think that's when they're at their best. But I can still feel when I listen to Steely Dan that behind it is a sort of sneering, slightly elitist, sarcastic view of the world, where they feel that they are cleverer and more sophisticated than everybody else. It's like it conjures up pictures of sort of coffee tables with, you know, large books of artistic photographs of cool people in the 50s. That's what Steely Dan personified for me, and we can see it in this photograph of them there. You know, they're indoors in some sort of very plush but slightly oldish seedy hotel. They're sat there looking super cool, and they've got sunglasses on even though it's very dimly lit in this room. And then there's that sort of guy in the background playing what looks like a cocktail piano. It's almost like an evocation of their childhood, the 1950s, and their sort of perception of what it would like to be in the future. I think this is why I like Nightfly so much, because Nightfly really mines that idea that these guys grew up in the 50s, they came to fruition in the 60s, where it was all about Jack Kerouac and the Beat Poets, and, you know, and the folk scene and cool jazz and Charlie Mingus, and that's their frame of reference. And then they hit the 70s and it's all about being in the Doobie Brothers or Bachman Turner Overdrive or whatever, and they form a rock band and they start to play with those ideas, but rather than doing it because they're so sophisticated and clever, rather than doing it in a way which is let's just use those influences, it's done in a sort of postmodern, ironic way. And so, however cheesy they get and however sort of almost yacht rock, Muzaki bland they get, we're supposed to sit and sort of appreciate it in its sort of postmodern, ironic, you know, nodding way. Which, of course, all the anal retentive fans that just like to know that it's absolutely perfection and this is the best recorded and this is the best playing and this is this and this and that, that those people, they don't get that at all. They don't care about this sort of postmodern irony in the lyrics, because for me, the best thing about Steely Dan, the thing that makes it different from saying, well, it's just like a Larry Carlton solo album with vocals on, is the lyrics. Now, as the late 70s, early 80s came in and all the sort of jazz rock musicians were sort of moving towards commerciality, they all had to bring vocals in, and most of them were not very good at it. They couldn't write lyrics, they didn't know what a song was about, and you get sort of really trite, awful songs, you know. Steely Dan, being sophisticated songwriters that use those references that come from jazz, rock and fusion, they then become the blueprint for all that awful jazz, rock, fusion, or whatever you want to call it, that comes in the 80s. You know, so if you take a guitarist like, say, Lee Ritenour, and I'm sure Lee Ritenour, I wouldn't know because I don't know enough, I'm sure Lee Ritenour is one of those guys that was turning up at sessions on Steely Dan albums. But if you take something like Lee Ritenour, when he emerges in the mid-70s with the album Captain Fingers, there's tracks on that I absolutely love. And the playing on that is way beyond anything that you'd get on a Steely Dan album. It's the same set of musicians. He's got Harvey Mason on, he's got Jeff Porcaro on it, you know, he's probably got Anthony Jackson on bass. It's the same set of musicians, but they are going for it. And then the opening track, Captain Fingers, it's an incredible fusion classic, that one is. But then when you delve into that album, he starts to do things like Stevie Wonder's Isn't She Lovely. Now, I could do a similar video about Stevie Wonder, but for me, Stevie Wonder's music is wonderful. And the difference between Stevie Wonder and Steely Dan for me, because they're both basically fusion groups with vocals, or fusion artists with vocals, is with Stevie Wonder, I feel he is open to the element of chance. He is open to the element of inspiration or capturing a moment. He's open to the grain of it not quite being there, that you feel a real performance is happening, right? And Stevie Wonder's voice is able to sell music or songs which refers back to his jazz upbringing. You could tell that Stevie Wonder listened to a lot of bossa nova, Antonio Carlos Jobim. He has those sort of chord changes in his songs, and that could sound very cheesy. And on Captain Fingers by Lee Ritenour, he does a version of Isn't She Lovely, and I love the Stevie Wonder version. I absolutely hate that. That is the maudlin direction we're going in. And for me, Steely Dan represent that. I know they're far more sophisticated, but there is something a little bit cheesy about what they do to me. So it's that commitment to sort of absolute perfection. It's the commitment to, you know, using jazz references at a time when that scene was moving towards a sort of quite middle of the road Fusac, and their influence on that, you know, they're probably best classified as yacht rock, you know, and they're probably the most sophisticated, you know, they're the kings of yacht rock, right? But there's no dirt. This is music for clever boys, you know. That's what I think. Clever, literate boys. That's, and I think that if I was to champion them, what I would say was, in terms of music, they have been highly influential in terms of training musicians. I was doing a gig the other day. I was playing with an absolutely fantastic guitar player. We were in a covers band, but we did Superstition, and he started to open up, and I could hear all those incredible licks coming out. And I walked up to him and I said, are you a big fan of Larry Carlton? He went, yeah, that, you know, I could hear that in the sound. He goes, and I absolutely love Steely Dan. So it's a training ground for those really competent musicians that have probably come in listening to rock. They're a gateway from rock to jazz, a completely different gateway than the one I came in. I came in through prog, you know, yes, King Crimson, Mavish Nuptia, Return to Forever, and then to Tony Williams' Lifetime, Miles Davis. That was my route into jazz and jazz fusion, although I had been brought up on a ton of, you know, West Coast cool jazz and classic jazz when I was a kid. But there's another line in for musicians, which is the Steely Dan route. The amount of guitarists that have joined covers bands and they're having to learn guitar solos, and they learn the guitar solo off, say, you know, All Right Now by Free, then they have to learn solo off a Led Zeppelin track or maybe a Queen track, and then suddenly the covers band, you know, asks them to do a Steely Dan track, you know, and they're suddenly having to do one of those tunes and learn, say, Larry Carlton's guitar solo or one of Jay Graydon's guitar solos. And those guys are serious jazz players with a very rich harmonic language. And there's an argument that when the jazz rock thing happened in the early 70s, people like Larry Coryell and John McLaughlin were incredible jazz players. They could play the changes, they could play giant steps, but they were searching for another way of expressing themselves, and they turned their back on that, and they embraced sort of Jimi Hendrix and the sort of pentatonic bendy scale and the sort of screaming distortion and the feedback and the out of controlness. And that's what I like. That's what I like about them. I know those guys can play all those changes, but they're not. So, you know, when you listen to like Bill Connors or Al Di Meola or John McLaughlin or Larry Coryell, any of those early burning guitarists, the part of jazz that they are expressing at that point is almost coming from free jazz. And there was an aspect of free jazz in Jimi Hendrix, and that's what they're doing. Now, you suddenly become aware when you listen to those albums that a lot of these players, when they're playing tunes, the saxophone player will play through the changes, pianist will play through the changes, and then it gets to the guitar solo. This is what the Brecker Brothers thing, you know. Brecker Brothers, they've played all through that, and then when it gets to the guitar solo, they just go down on the minor chord and they just go for it. And the players that came in, these Lee Ritners and there's you know, Larry Carltons, they could play the changes, and Steely Dan were writing tunes with heavy changes in, and not just having to play through different modulating changes, but chords that had lots of intervals in, the use of sort of suspended chords, extended chords, 11ths, 9ths, 13ths, you know, the use of altered dominance, you know, where you've got flat 9s, sharp 9s, you know, flat 5s, sharp 5s, all that was going on, and very strange shifts where the melody was following through chord changes that are going through a number of keys, very sophisticated stuff. And in Steely Dan's case, the guitar solos weren't like that sort of jazz rock expression where you just played the head and then we went for it, and it's all that group improvisation, Mavic and Orchestra, let's just, you know, launch at the sunset and see where we go. They wanted a guitar solo that would occupy the space that a guitar solo would on a pop record, so they have to play through the changes, and so you suddenly hear these solos which are incredibly innovative in terms of going through the changes, and this applies to all the, you know, all the instruments. If you're a drummer and you're coming up and you're learning songs, you might have to learn 50 Ways to Live Your Lover by Paul Simon, and you might have to learn Late in the Evening, where Steve Gadd does that, you know, double stick thing, and then you might have to, say, learn Steely Dan tracks, and the drumming's on it's incredible. Now I'm giving them some positivity. I think there's a point on their albums where their search for perfection didn't get perfection. They couldn't, you know, like edit notes and retune and do all this, and the drums were real and all that type of stuff. So when they were trying to get a take, they were trying to get something that was as close to their idea of perfection, and I think, knowingly or unknowingly, what they got was a vibe. They got the musician's take on it, you know, literally. The famous story of Steve Gadd coming in to do the drum solo on Asia, and Wayne Shorter. Wayne Shorter didn't even ask what the key was. He just put the headphones on apparently and just started to play. And that saxophone solo is absolutely him just feeling his way through the tune, and the opening notes, you can almost see him go, what key are we in? Oh yeah, with it. And he's so incredible at the phrasing that he can make that sound like, you know, the highest art. And Gadd's doing the same thing, you know. Gadd comes in and solos through that form, and that solo, I think he did it 2 takes, and I think they took the first one, something like that. And at one point, you know, he misses the drum and he hits the rim, and that has become a classic thing. It's that stuff that brilliant music is made out of. So here I'm arguing that their quest for perfection, at one point, because of the production process, they got perfection, in that they got perfection being the sort of balance of perfection with humanity, you know, with real feel. Now, when they ruled the world with Asia, they then went back into the studio and they decided to make Gaucho. And how many years were they in the studio trying to make this absolute masterpiece? And then the drum machine came in, and they went through a whole bunch of really almost like psychotic production approaches to try and get what they thought was perfection on record. Right? The things they did to drummers to try and make sure every single beat was absolutely locked to a grid. But when a drummer plays, or a guitarist or bass player plays, it doesn't matter how close you try and get to the absolute 0 point of that grid point in the rhythm, you could never hit it. If you zoom in, you're off. And you know, at some point you will see it doesn't marry up. A drum machine that's where it is. It's a complete opposite. And Gaucho seems to be a bit of a flop. And then Steely Dan are gone. And I think that was a blessing, because I think if they had gone into the 80s with the 80s production methods, I think Steely Dan would have been an absolute horrendous thing to hear. And perhaps they grew up, because then when they sort of return, was it in the 90s they come back? It sounds like they've let that slight, you know, groove and vibe, it's back in. But I think the reason is because in the original era of Steely Dan, the gigs weren't the issue, it was the albums. And then when they came back, it was the live show. I can remember when they took on Keith Carlock on drums, and I think before that they have Ricky Lawson on drums, and I bought that DVD that came out with Ricky Lawson on, and I love that because I love to hear those songs played live. They were absolutely nailed. You know, you go, oh, they're just perfect, the band's perfect, but they're not, because it's live, and it's that slight little tension in the sound that made me rather listen to the live DVD. And I also had I had quite a few bootleg videos of the tour with Keith Carlock on drums, and Keith Carlock was incredible. And I think when they brought Keith in, they sort of found a drummer, and for the first time maybe you got an album where he played all the way through, and they weren't trying to get all these different drummers, which must have been really disconcerting for the musicians. I feel like there's almost like a cruelty, there's a sneering, knowing cruelty, which borders on almost like seediness. So I've gone back to what I feel. This is what I feel when there's an underlying seediness to it. I'm not saying now. I mean, you know, Donald Fagen's a very, very old man. But I think that, you know, their comeback was a triumph. And I think, you know, they went around the world, and loads of people saw the tickets. And they became a great live act. And they were able to find that balance point again because of now concentrating on live and letting the chaos of the live concert temper their natural anal retentive ways. Right? So that's my take on Steely Dan. I've just told you what I think. I do really like them. If I'm driving in the car and a Steely Dan track comes on, I turn it up. If I'm in a band and we're doing a Steely Dan track, we did one the other day, was it Ricky Dan, Lose That Number? And that's a beacon in the set. You know, you enjoy playing it because it's such a great song. The musicianship's incredible. There's some incredible musical moments on those albums. But it's tempered with the ideas I have, and this is why I haven't got every single album, whereas I've got every Weather Report album, I've got every Yes album pretty much until they go rubbish after Big Generator, and I've got every Mavish Knockshot, every John McLaughlin album, virtually all the Frank Zappa albums, because I love those. And whereas when I bought Asia, that was the first album I bought, and I really liked it, and I got it really for Gad's solo, and I liked it, but the music didn't blow me away, and so I was happy to just go and buy this album, Steely Dan's Greatest Hits, and I was happy with that. Do It Again, Reeling in the Years, My Old School, Body Zappa, Showbiz Kids, East St. Louis Toodaloo. That's a great record where they sort of really go right back to Duke Ellington. It's those references. I don't think people quite understand why the jazz references are there. Anyway, what I wanted to do on this video, I wanted to just talk about a band. I've been doing a lot of clickbaity stuff, Right, if this video does really well, I will just sit back and go, well, I'll just go and talk seriously. I haven't been silly, I haven't cracked any jokes, there's no abstract surrealness going on in this video. So I'm trying that out with Steely Dan. I thought I can't do that with Steely Dan, although it would be funny, wouldn't it? It would be funny to poke fun, but I'm going to stop because I can feel the surrealist humour, you know, aspect of me bubbling up there. So if you liked this video where I just come on and I switched my camera on as well, and I'm pretty sure it's in some sort of cinema scope, you know. So if you are watching this in the cinema, so see, I had to be silly in the end. Anyway, if you liked it, like it. If you want to subscribe, please subscribe. And if you want to see the next video, ring the notification bell. If you want to support me, you can come over to Patreon, and the link is down there. And at Patreon, there's loads of videos. There's all my solo albums for free download. There's interviews, and you get to join the Patreon meet, where we all get together, and sometimes I bring special guests in. A few weeks ago we had Bevan from ELO. He came in and he had a chat to the patrons. You will meet some incredible musicians, and you never know if I can pull it off. A few jazz or prog legends. So become a patron, you know, and see what you think. If you don't like it after a month, you can leave. You know, they never do though. They never leave. Once you're there, you never leave. Well, some do. If Patreon is not for you, however, because you're a very busy person and you don't get pulled into having to watch tons of my content and you think this is enough, which I can totally understand, I have a tip jar, and it's called the Andy Indians YouTube tip jar. I can't remember what I called it. Anyway, you'll see it's a PayPal that you just click on. It's really straightforward. It's the easiest way to just give me money. And all of those of you that have been doing that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I look every morning and there's a few 50p's in, maybe a £5, and you know, $10 here, and a few people are stuck in some reasonable sums of money that I just can't believe my luck to have come here, talked about the music I love, and then get beautiful people to give me money because that they love it too. It's not me, it's the music. But I tell you one thing, I ain't giving the money to the music, I'm keeping it. Alright, I've finished up there. I'll see you on the next video, and thanks for watching this one.